We just want to welcome you because we know that you have done other sessions for us in the past, and it has been hugely helpful. And it's always such fantastic information that you share with us. So thank you for taking time out of your crazy busy schedule. You know, as lawyers, you guys have lots and lots of your days that are just chewed up with lots of real estate plus everything else that you do. So thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome.
So I will hand it over to you. If you just, do you need anything that you need to share the screen?
No, I think I'm just gonna talk.
Perfect.
I started kind of sketching this out over the weekend, and then I realized that it was actually a really big topic.
Yeah.
And it's something that I'm getting asked about way more than I used to be. Used to be that a tenant question would come up, you know, every 2 or 3 weeks. Now it's almost a daily thing that somebody's encountering an issue with the tenant.
Okay.
So what I thought I'd do was I'd kind of talk about it in a few pieces. Like one would be just trying to show home right now, in particular with the brand new restrictions that just came out, and then kind of look at if somebody's assuming a tenancy and how that looks. And then the one I'm getting asked about the most is kind of removing a tenant, giving a tenant notice that it's going to be owner occupied. And then if we've got time, kind of talking about, you know, what you can do for your clients who are going to be dealing with this, kind of like some best practices for it. So the stuff right now, as you all know, is constantly changing, and I'm always playing catch up. And I know NSAR has been involved a lot with the province as well. And through Relands, I've been involved to some extent, just trying to give some input into the provincial government, so that they don't just keep kind of making rules and not really thinking about all the other pieces. So on Friday, they came out with this new order, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, that says that a tenant now needs to consent before you can show a property. So if they don't consent, and I'm thinking most tenants are not going to consent because tenants are pretty cranky right now, as I'm sure you've all realized, the landlord can go in with one other person, take videos and pictures on 24 hours notice. What that order is silent on is what happens after there is an offer. And I've asked for some feedback from the province on that. It doesn't say, you know, you can go back afterward with a home inspector, for example. And every part of me knows that tenants are going to start waving this order saying, you can't come back. You've already been here once. So I'm hoping to get some clarity on that at some point, because my crystal ball tells me that that's going to be the next thing that comes up. And if I do get any kind of clarity on that, I'll share it with your office. So for the time being, and at least till June 30th, we need a tenant's consent in order to show a home. Once you're in there, you've got to follow all the COVID protocols, as I'm sure you're all aware. What I have been running into is tenants just consistently saying they're self-isolating. And unfortunately, there's really no way to get around that. I was on a call a few weeks ago with Dr. Schrang and a few other interested parties. And one of the questions was, if a tenant is currently isolating and their lease is up, do I have to let them stay past their lease? The answer to that was actually no, so long as they had somewhere else to go. So as long as they could leave that location and go and isolate in their new apartment, then that was fine. Although then, of course, there's always this shade of gray. And well, if they don't have anywhere to go, I don't know who would never have anywhere to go, but they'd kind of say, well, call 311 and see. But he did say, no, it's not an excuse to continue on in your lease because you're isolating. I haven't had that happen with a client yet, but again, I can see that argument coming. So before you even start to show a home, I would look at the type of lease that's in place. There's a really big difference in notice provisions between a fixed term and a periodic lease. So a couple of years ago, there was all kinds of changes to the Tenancies Act that affected how we give notice to our tenants, and it really took away a lot of the landlord's ability to get rid of a tenant. So if someone has a fixed term lease, so that's a beginning date and an end date. So it starts on January 1st, it ends on December 31st. On December 31st, their lease is up at midnight, they're gone. If you have a fixed term lease and you're trying to sell a property, you can't get rid of them until the end of the fixed term. So they're there till December 31st. So you got to make sure that you know if you've got that fixed term or if you've got the typical periodic lease, like your month to month or your year to year. If there's no lease in place, if they've just got a verbal, or if they had a fixed term and then they didn't bother doing a new fixed term, they just kind of let it keep going, then by default, they're in a periodic lease. So with a periodic lease, we do have the ability to give notice as long as we can fit inside the boxes. So if you've got, say, a year to year or a month to month, and your buyer is an individual, so it can't be a company that's buying, you've got 4 units or less in there, and all your other conditions are met other than title. So you can leave lawyer review open. So maybe give yourself a little bit more time on lawyer review on those transactions if you can. Then you do have the ability to give 2 months notice if it's going to be owner occupied or immediate family owner occupied. So that sounds kind of more complicated than it is. I mean, at the end of the day, most of your clients coming in are going to be an individual buyer that's going to be owner occupying, hopefully, in theory. So if that's the case, what has to happen is there has to be a statutory declaration prepared. So I have been kind of getting with packages, just kind of formal statements. That's not good enough. It has to be a sworn declaration. So it has to be in front of a commissioner of oaths or a notary public. Right now, during the pandemic, Nova Scotia lawyers have the ability to virtually commission somebody. So that is an option. The stat deck should say in it, if it's not being prepared by a lawyer, it should say the date they're intending to occupy it, that there is a firm offer in place, and that this is going to be owner occupied. So there's some actual language in the Tenancies Act that's useful. I'll actually send through my precedent so that you all have it, because it's helpful, and maybe it'll save your clients from paying a lawyer to prepare it. It'll just be a matter of commissioning it. So the other sticky piece on this is, so you've got that sworn declaration that has to go back to the seller, and then the seller has to formally serve that along with a form. So the form's DR2. It's online on the tenancies board. So that statutory declaration gets attached to that form, and it has to be served on the tenant. So it's really easy to get caught up in the notice stuff with the tenancies board because of their counting days policy. So 2 months isn't just straight 2 months. So you have to know the beginning date, so when rent is due. So most people's rent is due on the 1st. So if rent is due on the 1st, in order for it to count as 2 full months notice, you have to give them notice before the 1st. So if you want to give notice for 2 months from June 1st, you would have to give notice on or before May 31st. Because if you give it on the 2nd, you can't tell them they have to be gone 2 months on the 2nd. Does that make sense? And I see people get hung up on it all the time because you think 2 months, okay, gave it to you on the 15th, you've had notice for more than 2 months. So that's kind of like the sticky piece on it. So service has to be, if it's in their lease that they'll allow for email service, that's okay. I'm not a big fan of that. Because it makes it easier for people to argue that they didn't get served. My preference is always just in person, hand deliver it, or either have it sent by courier with them having signed for it, or a process server. You can send by registered mail as long as you put return receipt stamped envelope in it. I think they seem to have received it after 3 days. Just the cleanest way is always just to have it hand delivered if at all possible, because then it makes it more difficult for them to argue. So in theory, if you've given proper notice, when those 2 months are up, then they're going to be vacated. If they dispute it, then you're going to end up making an application to the director. The tenancies board's open right now, but they're 4 to 6 weeks behind. They're all virtual right now. It's, if you've given proper notice, you could probably push it along if you did have that firm agreement. But if the more time you can give your clients in there, the better. So that if we know that someone's going to be disputing it, we've got a little bit of time to get ahead of it and try to push them out of there. And I have had people dispute it this past year, and there's really nothing to dispute. It's valid notice, but people will try just about anything in order to get, in order to slow things down. The other thing to be aware of is once you serve that notice on the tenant can actually leave within 10 days. So they can give notice that they're leaving in 10 days. So you might want to prepare your seller client for that, you know, maybe you're giving them notice 4 months ahead of time. They might bounce after 10 days and then you're going to have a vacant unit. So I just kind of give them the heads up that their tenant does have the right to hop out of there on 10 days notice once they receive that. Let's see. So if someone's assuming a tenant, a little bit of a different story, a little bit easier for your point of view. The big thing with that, again, would be to get the leases ahead of time. So that your client knows what they're getting into. You really want to make sure that they're not kind of like maybe they have fixed terms and they're all going to be up within a month of closing or right before closing. So there's potential that some of those units are either going to end up vacant or they're accidentally going to start rolling into those periodic leases because your client didn't realize that 2 days after closing their leases were expired. The other thing right now is a lot of people are having a hard time paying rent. So it's nice if you can get rent rolls or some sort of proof that rent's been paid so that your client's not inheriting a big mess. Your client should be aware that there are some adjustments. So what we do is if there's damage deposits, we just credit that back to the buyer. So that comes off the seller's proceeds. Then the seller can just take the damage deposit personally themselves. So we credit over to the buyer the damage deposit and any prepaid rent for the remainder of the month. If there's back rent, that's for the seller to figure out. We don't push that on the buyer to try and collect it unless they've got some sort of side agreement to try to figure that out. You want them to, normally the lawyers will handle this, to kind of discuss that there's no current hearings in front of the tenancies board from a tenant. So you want to make sure that no tenants are currently going after the landlord for anything, in particular if you've got condition of premises, because your client is assuming whatever leases are there. So whatever currently exists, they're assuming that. If they say there are no leases and it's just verbal, then I would, if you can, insist that they enter into some sort of lease, either with your new buyer potentially, or with the current owner that will be assumed afterward. Because never fail when my client says, no, we're fine with assuming the verbal leases. Afterward, they come back and say, oh, well, they actually agreed, even though it says that this month I only had to pay $900, not $1,400. Or you said that they'd fix the fridge, and you kind of go down this rabbit hole. So, you know, I try to stay away from verbal leases and at least try to fix it before closing so that it's on the seller, unless I represent the seller. And then I just say, cool, it's a verbal lease. Go crazy. You can take it. What else? I know everyone's aware of the rent cap that's kicking around right now. So 2% is the maximum that rents can be raised until the state of emergency is lifted or until February 1st, whatever comes up. I anticipate that there's probably going to be some kind of appetite for something like that continuing long run. I wouldn't be surprised. So I've been prepping my clients for that and saying, you know, right now there is a rent cap. If you've got a fixed term lease, at the end of the fixed term lease is up, you can do whatever you want. You can charge whatever you want. So I've really been encouraging my clients to go into a fixed term lease instead of these periodic leases. One, you're not stuck with somebody. So at the end of the term, you can just get rid of them. And two, you're not really bound by this rent cap stuff because the lease is dead at the end of that fixed term. So I've been really pushing my clients towards that. And I've seen a really big shift in that with rentals, a lot of people going towards those fixed terms. who knows what they'll say with rent cap fixed terms if they go any further with that. But right now, that's kind of the safest spot for your client to be in, is these fixed term leases. So, the big thing right now, I would say, is just to know the tenant, to get an idea of how they're going to react to either the showings and the notice. Unfortunately, my experience has been the worst tenants know the law the best. So they know all the kind of ways to get around. And there's been a lot of push towards social media with clients going online and complaining about the landlords. I've seen them complaining about realtors, posting pictures of realtors saying, look at this horrible person showing this house. So, and I've had clients just simply take down listings because they just couldn't deal with, with the pressure coming from the tenant. And when you get into Facebook and that sort of thing, as a lawyer, you can push and you can try to scare people on it, but once it's out there, it kind of takes a life of its own, and it's really hard to chase all the pieces. So I'd have a discussion with your client ahead of time, like how's your tenant going to react to this? And you'll get an idea when you start showing how they're going to be, and maybe give yourself that little bit more time to make sure that you're going to be able to get them out of there. The other thing would be too, is because both parties have an obligation if you're having a tenant removed. So if it's going to be owner occupied, both the buyer has to sign that declaration by a certain date and the seller has to serve it by a certain date. So you can say, your seller's going to give vacant possession, but at least that requires the buyer to do something. So think about putting in your agreement that the buyer will provide the required declaration on or before a certain date, because otherwise you've got your seller committing to give vacant possession and they can't give vacant possession because the buyer didn't do the piece that they had to do. So I would look at putting something like that in there if you are representing the sellers, because otherwise the seller's going to be on the hook for vacant possession, and really it's out of their hands because they don't have that declaration.
Danielle, do you have a clause for that?
I do. Yep, I'll send it through. Okay,
that would be great. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
Danielle, if you're taking over a rented condo, for example, and the old lease did not include storage, and now the tenant wants storage, so you're actually renting them the more space, can you go above that 2%?
Well, I guess you would be, I don't see why not, because you would be adding something onto the lease. You can't take anything away because that's considered a price increase. If you're adding something in, I would do a formal lease revision and have both of them sign on it. Or even better, tell them you can add that, but you're going to do a whole new fixed term lease and get them out of what they're currently in. Definitely put something in writing and have the client agree to it. I ideally would do a brand new lease for something like that, just to make it really clear that you're not under any of that.
Ideal, that's what we're going to do. I wanted to make sure I wasn't telling them to do it.
I would do a new one, because then it's really clear. And I assume it's a tenant that's asking for the storage unit, so it's their favor. So I would just push them into a new lease if you could.
Ideal.
Excuse me. Hi. Is there a full release form available that you can have tenants sign with a date? Being from Ontario, sometimes when you're selling an income property, you would kind of do that ahead of time. Sometimes giving up, say, a month's rent to that tenant to assure that they would be out to have vacant closing. Is that something that's possible?
You could do it, but you're not, the tenancies board isn't bound by that. So I've had clients do that and say, I'll give you $1,000 if you agree that you leave by July 1st. We can do that and we can prepare an agreement, but they can still take you to the tenancies board because you can't contract out of the notice provisions in the Tenancies Act. You could then sue them for your money back, but it wouldn't prevent you from having that issue with the tenancies board. So it's an unfortunate little quirk, and I've had lots of clients do that. I've only had one person get burned on it where they just changed their mind. it's risky thing. It's risky. Again, you just got to kind of know the tenant. Most tenants don't realize that. They think they've signed off on it and that's that. It's the sneaky ones that are going to call the tenancies board and clue in that you can't contract out of those notice provisions. Anyone else?
Danielle. Hi, it's Tammy Gannon. How are you?
Not too bad. How you doing, Tammy?
I'm good, thanks. So, a question for you. If you have a buyer who has had a tenant removed so that they can move into a property, is there a minimum amount of time that they have to remain in that property before they could re-tenant it?
So it's the wording in the Tenancies Act is they intend to occupy either themselves or their family in good faith. So there's no set timeline on it. Is it possible that somebody could challenge it afterward if they saw it listed, for rent maybe a month later? Possibly. And then you would just have to backtrack and show why circumstances changed. So there's no set timeline. It just says you intend in good faith to do it. So if it happened that, realistically, maybe you were planning on occupying it and then you lost your job and you ended up having to go back to Ontario, then that would be, you show that you intended in good faith to occupy it and then you couldn't, but it would be on the landlord, I would say, to show that they had intended to good faith occupy it. But there's nothing there's nothing in writing that says how long that has to be.
Okay, thanks. I've had that question a few times from different investors, and I was just. Thank you.
You're welcome.
When you terminate a lease on a tenant and they leave their stuff behind, how long are you responsible for it and what do you have to do? There
is a form online for that. There's an actual process for abandoned personal property. It's right on the residential tenancy site. I don't know off the top of my head, but there is an actual process and there's a form for dealing with abandoned property.
Are you allowed to make the decision whether or not it's garbage?
Well, there's a value on it. I believe the value is $500, but don't quote me on that. But if it's a nominal, there is a procedure there for something of nominal value.
Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome.
Sam had raised his hand. Do you have a question, Sam?
I do, yeah. So with the D2 form, there's nowhere on that form for the current tenants to sign. So I had a client. Their issue was, yes, I presented it. Yes, they got it, but now it's word against word. So like, what would you suggest I say to them in the sense, because I was under the impression that they signed it, gave it back so that we could prove they got it.
There's nothing for them to sign. So did they personally serve it or did they have it served?
They personally served it and did registered mail. They did both.
Yeah. So they have proof then that it's been served. And even if they had just personally served, they could swear an affidavit saying, but where they've also done the registered mail, just tell them to keep the registered mail receipt. So if it is challenged, that they prove that they did do service.
Perfect, thanks.
I wish there was something to sign and send back,
Yeah.
but honestly, if there was, people wouldn't sign it anyway, then they would think they could stop it by not signing it. I know I sound like I've got to hate on for tenants, but it's been a really rough couple months for me and probably for all of you with tenants too. I think I've seen it all in the last couple months.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm not sure if it's already been addressed exactly or not, but if a buyer decides to purchase a property and there's a month-to-month tenant there, is there, if you give notice right away for closing with the 2 months, that's fine. But what if the buyer wants to move in, say, 4 or 6 months or 8 months later? Is it just a matter of giving notice at that point?
So if it's going to be owner occupied, that is another way to have a tenant removed, and there's a process with the Residential Tenancies Board that you can follow for that.
Okay. So it doesn't have to be done sort of right at closing or anything?
It doesn't have to be. No, there is a process for if it's going to be owner occupied that you can apply to take the unit over.
Sorry, Danielle, it's
Okay,
Anna Silva, broker. I was just going to add something for David. And Danielle, I'll get you to clarify for me. The only question might be in terms of keeping a tenant for a period of time would be the terms of the mortgage. If they're supposed to own or occupy immediately upon funding versus it being tenant occupied.
Yeah, that's fair.
So David, you would have to, that would be a conversation to have with your lender, client's lender and your client's lawyer. Because if they're getting a residential mortgage, they can't be renting it, and that goes against the terms of the residential mortgage that they just took, if it's supposed to be owner occupied.
Oh, okay, good, thanks, good information.
Yeah, I have seen some lenders make small exceptions if you know that somebody's not going to be moving for maybe 3 months. But you're right, Anne, like there's a lot of times when I receive mortgage instructions, it's very clear that it has to be owner occupied. And if I know that it's not going to be owner occupied and we're adjusting for rent, I have to disclose that to the lender, and that's likely going to change the amount that they can borrow in the terms of the mortgage.
And potentially their eligibility entirely in terms of what they were given. So it's David, it's not, unfortunately, what you're probably getting from Danielle here is there is not a lot of black and white in this situations that we're dealing with. And, you know, you'd have to consult in the specifics. You might get permission if they can't enter the province, for example, maybe now, I don't know, to keep the tenant in for a little bit, but most residential lenders are going to want a specific date for that human to be out.
Anyone else? I said the key to all this is just, you know, review the lease up front, get the leases up front when you've got these listings, and just make sure that you know what you're dealing with, and make sure your client is prepared to have to deal with the tenant, and make sure that everybody knows what their obligations are. Like I said, I'm happy to send that clause through that I put in there. And give the lawyer the heads up that a property is rented, so that we can get ahead of it. Sometimes the rental piece is kind of sprung on me at the last minute, and I haven't had time to look at, the affidavit's already gone out. I didn't have anything to do with it. It's deficient, and I'm hoping that the tenant doesn't know that it's deficient, or I'm sending out numbers to the other lawyer and they're coming back and it's got rental adjustments, and then I've got this owner occupied mortgage. So I always appreciate the heads up if it is rented. And even if it's just say it's currently rented, but the tenant's going to be gone on June 1st, so you don't have to worry about it. That keeps me from kind of having to chase it. It's just good for me to be able to get ahead of it. And really good luck, because it's like the Wild West out there right now with tenants. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you are online now, and a lot of these Facebook groups with Ask Nova Scotia and Talk Bedford, all these groups, people are constantly asking, can my landlord do this? Can my landlord list the house? What are my rights here? And a lot of times landlords themselves don't know what the rights are, and a lot of people aren't aware of the notice provisions under the Tenancies Act and the changes in there. I think a lot of landlords still think, oh, well, the year's almost up, I can give them 3 months notice and they're gone. And that's just not the case anymore. Because I'll have landlords say to me, oh, it's fine, they're on month to month. Like, that doesn't mean anything at all for you in giving somebody notice if they're month to month or year to year. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there still, and there's a lot of misinformation on the internet. I'll sometimes sit and start reading comments out of curiosity, and you can look and you can see like 20 different answers on what's the notice, what are the requirements. Like, nobody's really sure. The tenancies board is actually great if you call them with a question. They're pretty good for answering. I find them very responsive. So sometimes it's just a matter of picking up the phone and asking them, and they're usually pretty happy to give you an answer or look into it, or call the lawyer on the file and just run it by them. And I mean, you all know where to find me. If you have a question, I don't care if it's my file. If I know the answer, I'm happy to tell. Just call or send me a note.
Okay, I just want to clarify something. I have an inquiry from a client who is currently renting. The owner of the building has said that they're putting it up for sale and she has to go. She doesn't have a lease. So she's been there for years. And like, does she have any rights, like not only just for viewings, but for her timeline to be out of there?
Yeah, if you don't have a lease, it's as if you have the standard form lease that's online on the tenancies board. It's called Form P.
Yeah.
So if she doesn't have a lease, it's like she's got a month-to-month lease. So they would still have to go through that process of the 2 months notice with the sworn declaration. So I'm seeing a lot of landlords now, before they even list the property, saying to tenants, you have to leave. Can't do that. Can't do that until you've got the firm offer and you've got the stat deck from the potential buyer served. And I see a lot of that where they already told the tenants, I'm like, you didn't tell the tenants anything. You might as well just throw it in the garbage. But if she's just on a verbal, it's like she's got that standard form lease. So she's still entitled to that process, the 2 months notice and the statutory declaration served on her. So until they know that someone that's buying it's going to be owner occupied, that landlord has no right to tell her that she has to be gone.
And so she would be given her 2 months notice after the offer's been accepted.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And as far as viewings, it's the same thing. She still has the right of any tenant right now. It's virtual
You got her.
viewings and yeah. Okay.
Yeah. She's got all the rights of any tenant. Anytime you've got a verbal, it's like you've got that standard form lease.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I have a question, and this might have already been asked. If somebody has occupied a unit for, let's say, 20 some years, is that any different than any other tenant?
No.
No, so it's the same thing. They would probably, if it was a verbal, it would go month to month. They'd probably be a month to month and only two months notice, exactly the same.
2 months, yeah, exact same process.
Okay. And on the DR2 form, so this is something that some people are thinking is, if you are going to be owner occupied, is there a length of time you have to be owner occupied?
No, we talked about it. It's good faith.
Sorry.
So it has
Okay.
to be good faith. You intend in good faith, either the owner or a family member to occupy. So there's no set time in there. So the onus would be on you if you were challenged on it to prove that you had intended in good faith to occupy it, or you'd only temporarily occupied it. I'm not aware of anyone ever being challenged on that. But I suppose the risk always would be that somebody would be looking online and seeing that something was listed, a month or two after the closing. And like I said, then the onus would be on you to show that you had intended to good faith occupy it, or you had and then chose not to.
Okay, well, it's good to know. Not that I would do that, but there's some people out there that would maybe go ahead and occupy it for 2 months, renovate it, and then say, "Oh, I changed my mind about living here."
Yeah, and I have run into that sometimes and had to have a conversation with my client about what good faith means and what the risks are of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, we'll see what happens in the next couple of months. I'm just glad my clients can move to Nova Scotia again. I'm sure you all are too, because I was getting an awful lot of texts and phone calls on that one. And we'll see what happens in the future with this tenancy stuff and having to consent to showings and the rent cap. I don't know. There's so much public pressure right now, I think, on the government to protect tenants that I can't see a lot of this stuff getting better for landlords. I anticipate it's probably going to go a little bit tighter or at least stay the same, but we'll see, I guess.
Yes, that's why they don't call it the landlord's board, eh?
Well, this is the reason everybody is selling their rentals. You've got these big high values right now. Then you've got a rent cap and all these impossible to deal with notice provisions. No wonder people are selling. I would sell my rentals too if I had any left. They'd be gone. So I don't know if these protections have the effect that they think that they're going to have. Maybe with bigger buildings, but not with the smaller people that we would tend to deal with that just own 1 or 2 unit buildings.
I have a quick
Dennis.
question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tina. And
Well,
then Dennis.
Oh, sorry about that. I just was curious as to what is your most common problem with tenants? Well, with this type of property, like a
So
coming up
the
frequently?
biggest thing I'm running into is tenants just refusal to allow a property to even be shown. So it seems like once you get past that hiccup, once all the proper notices are served, the tenancies board has been doing a good job of saying to people when they call, you got the proper notice, so you really can't dispute this. It's the beginning part, because I'm having clients call me at least once a month and say, I'm trying to sell and my tenant won't let anybody in, or my tenant is filming me trying to let somebody in. So that's my biggest problem right now. I've twice in this last year had closing day come and go and the tenant just hadn't left. But neither one was a surprise. We knew that they were disputing it and that they were going to be difficult. Doesn't make things any easier for the seller or the buyer when you get into that, because then you get into having to go make an application to the tenancies board. Unless you've got no lease at all, like your lease is officially terminated with like a fixed term and you were clear that they had to go, the sheriff's not going to get involved till you get that order from the tenancies board, which is unfortunate because they're just going to say, oh, this is in dispute and you've got to deal with it. But the biggest problem right now is they don't want people in the houses to be showing it. So hopefully this order will help that, because it doesn't say, hey, you can't show it. It just says, hey, if you don't agree, here's the process that you have to follow. And hopefully that clarity will help realtors a little bit actually be able to say, no, I do have the right to do this. It just has to be done in this way.
So,
Go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted just clarity on, we just get a new client who has a tenant and they want to be advised. Is there what would you say would be a good process in which for us to go through in order, from the first to the last step?
I'd get the lease right away, or the leases. So get the leases right away and have a look at them. Make sure that, if they're fixed term or periodic. So make sure they know if it's a fixed term that tenant cannot go until the end of that date. So that's something that you'll have to look at when you're negotiating your closing date. And if it's the periodic, then you can discuss the notice provisions with them. I would make sure they're aware that once that notice is served, that tenant can bounce pretty quickly. So make sure that they have the ability to cover the mortgage payments, or maybe work something out with the other realtor that if that does happen, you can bump the closing date up. And I would just ask them for some feedback on the tenant. How do you think your tenant is going to react to this? What kind of tenant are they? Are they a difficult tenant? The nicest way is if they have a good relationship is to have the landlord talk to the tenant in advance and see how they feel about the house being showed. And rather than kind of springing it on them. But the biggest thing is just to get that lease and make sure they're financially able to carry that property if they need to, once that notice is served.
So, hi Danielle, I just wanted to clarify something for myself about owner occupied for 4 units or less. Now, I know that hypothetically speaking, one owner could not possibly occupy all 4 units, like if it was a family, but in saying that, you can say, so I just want to clarify for myself that an owner occupied of one of those 4 units has the right to vacate the other 3 units.
Say that, so you're asking if they could take all 4 units for family?
Yes, that's my understanding. That I just want to clarify that.
In theory, I don't see anything that says that you couldn't. You'd have to serve all the notices individually. I haven't actually looked into that, but I don't see why you couldn't, because it just says that the unit will be owner occupied or immediate family.
Okay, so if they all moved into one of the 4 units and they just moved into 1 unit, so they could still do that to the other 3 units?
No, the actual unit has to be occupied.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Dennis?
I'm up. Thanks. I'm not a fast enough writer, so I'm just gonna go right back to the start just for a quick second. So I have a potential listing, and we've actually pushed it because of the last lockdown that we just were in. So my question is obviously it's up to them whether or not the property gets shown. I just want you to go back a little bit here. So I'm allowed to go in and do a video and pictures for the buyers, or is that the buyer's agents allowed to go in and do that for theirs? How does that work?
The landlord plus one person.
Okay, so landlord plus one person, and then
is allowed to go in one time.
And then did you come up with a conclusion? Because I kind of missed that as I was writing it for the inspection and stuff. What was the
I
conclusion?
don't know the answer to that. Like when you read the order, it relates just to showings. So presumably you can't have multiple showings. You can only have that one time to go in and do the video, which would mean by default that you would still have to let people in to do inspections, et cetera, but it's actually silent on that. I don't think that's on purpose. I think they just didn't contemplate it because they're not in the real estate industry. So I'm trying to get some clarity on that because I do foresee that kind of being the next thing that people are going to push back on. But if the order itself, if you read it, it just relates specifically to showings and not anything that would happen after a showing.
So just potentially a revision.
There's a gap there. There's a gap there for sure in the order. They just simply didn't address it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I must have completely misunderstood that because I'm looking at that and I thought the agent or the landlord and the agent could go in and do a video with the buyers, but you're saying the landlord and
one other person
can only do it once. Okay.
Yeah. See, I actually have it printed off here. Looking at it the other day. This is my life now, constantly following chasing the government orders. So it says landlord needs the consent. An alternative under 24 hours notice is the landlord may enter the unit once together with no more than one person to take photographs, a video, or similar representation of the unit and to provide a virtual showing, as long as you have the 24 hours and comply with all the health restrictions. So only one time. So you wouldn't be able to go in with the buyer's agent. They'd basically be buying based on that video, the initial video. And the fines between $500 and $10,000 and up to $100,000 per corporation.
Nice.
So literally the way that I just heard that is if I have two showings, they just have to use the same video.
Yep.
That's all they get is the video. So what happens when we go over there to go take measurements? So that everything has to be done at the same time?
You're gonna have to do it at the same, based on this, and this just till June 30th, based on this, you're only allowed in one time. Yeah.
But if it's the landlord and one other person, wouldn't that be the photographer? You wouldn't be able to even do the measurement.
Whoever you decided it was, I guess. So
it's
really clear that it's the landlord and one other person. So they're clearly trying to cool the market down a little bit on the rental stuff. They're trying to make it as difficult as possible. But it says very clearly the landlord and one other person. If there's no consent, if they consent, you can go in with the football team if you want, in theory, as long as you're complying with all the orders. It's just if they don't consent. So then it very clearly says that landlord plus one person. So it's going to be painful for you guys to really, I mean, it's likely going to be the landlord and the listing agent. The listing agent is going to be trying to do the video and the measurements and everything.
That's why we have access to Matterhorn.
Yeah.
So June 30th is what I heard you say, right? Correct?
June 30th. And a few weeks ago, I was on a call where they'd actually suggested with Ed of province buyers that your closing date be June 30th or later. So they seem to be really hung up on this June 30th date. So I wasn't really surprised to see that date, although the real estate lawyer and we absolutely cringed when they said closing date's June 30th, like one of my busiest days of the year. Then I immediately got like 10 deals with a June 30th closing date and I wanted to cry. So yeah, it's till at least June 30th. So presumably if things are calmed down by June 30th, they'll lift that. I'm hoping that they do, but they seem to be looking at things kind of in two week blocks. It's not going to make it easy for you if a tenant isn't going to consent to to the showings, and I don't anticipate most of them are going to consent to it based on what I've been seeing.
Joe Phoenix.
Hi, yeah, I have a question regarding kind of worst case scenario. So if there's an uncooperative tenant who does not want to leave, they stay at closing, what's kind of a worst case scenario timeline to get them out through legal processes?
It depends on how long it takes the board to get the hearing. It's right now they're 4 to 6 weeks out. So you could try and get an emergency hearing, but it really just depends on if you can convince the board. It's all on how quick you can get them to review it. So if there's a specific form that you can file, it's form J. And if you've got all the proper notices and everything, in theory, then they should approve it fairly quickly. Of course, they can also appeal that. Which could hold things up. If you've got a tenant that knows the law and knows the appeal process, you could be looking at a couple of months realistically.
Christina, do you have a question?
I do. If a tenant is on month to month, can the landlord choose to give them notice that they won't be renewing the lease?
Now, if you've got a periodic lease, it renews infinitely unless you fall under one of the exceptions. So breach of statutory conditions, so destroying the property basically. It can't be inhabited anymore. You can't evict anyone for renovations right now. Owner occupied, or going to be owner occupied in the future with our process that we talked about here, or failure to pay rent with an application to the director. So it really doesn't matter from a landlord's point of view if you're month to month or year to year anymore. There's no notice provisions other than those exceptions. So it only matters to the tenant because the tenant only has to give you a month's notice if they're on a month to month. It doesn't matter for the landlord. They don't have the right just to give you, they have basically automatic security of tenure in Nova Scotia. Unless you have a fixed term lease, you've security of tenure almost right away.
Okay. And if it's a hoarder's situation and the landlord has photographs, it was unbelievable. I couldn't believe people live like this.
Yeah. So that would be a breach of statutory conditions. So there's standard conditions, and that would be one of them would be basically you're making it unsafe or it's unfit, you're not looking after the property, it's a danger to others, that kind of thing. You can make an application to the director to have the lease terminated, but you do need to go through the tenancies board to get that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And there's all kinds of processes right online. The Tenancies Board actually has a really nice website on there. And you can see there's all the different types of applications are all in there. So if you just look at breach of statutory conditions, it'll show you the right form to apply for there.
Well, Danielle, we so appreciate your time. We know we want to respect your time, so we don't want to keep you any longer than. But yes, if anyone has any last question or comment, we'll just take a minute or two, but then we'll try to wrap up so that Danielle can get back to doing what she is doing best, keeping us all at our hot water.
It's the best.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're most welcome. Good luck.
Thank you.
It's crazy times.
Thank you
It's
so
crazy
much.
times out there.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you
was great.
so much for your time.
Thank you, Danielle.
You're welcome.
Danielle,
Bye,
just
guys.
before you go, can I ask you a question off topic?
Sure.
When there's a right of way or a lease on a property,
Yep.
and you want it removed, there's a term for that, isn't there?
If you want it removed,
Yeah.
so it would depend on what the terms were, but normally you would actually need the agreement of the other party, so they would sign off on it as well, and you would just do a release of right away or a release of the lease, unless you could argue somehow that it was extinguished, but that would really be harder to do than just have a formal release done up.
Extinguish was the word I was looking for. I couldn't remember what it was, but it was where there was a public right of way, but because somebody hasn't used it for 2 or 3 years. it's probably no longer effective, right?
Like, yeah, like you'll see a lot of that in the older subdivisions, like they'll have the right to cross over Smith Street, and now Smith Street is a public road. In those cases, normally we would just remove it when you were doing a migration because it's no longer, it's no longer applicable. But if it's, you know, over another property, typically both the dominant and the servient parcel owners would have to consent to that, and then you would file a formal release.
Okay. And one other question, Todd Smith and I are arguing over this. You can only squat on federal land, right?
You can't squat on federal land. You actually can't adversely possess federal land. It's one of the few things that you can't, unless maybe there's some thought over if it's over 40 years, but typically you can't adversely possess the crown. You can, if there's a difference between if something's migrated and not migrated when it comes to possessory title. So if something is not migrated and you've got 20 years of active, open, continuous, notorious use that's undisputed and without consent, then with statutory declarations filed and proper notice served, you can attempt to adversely possess all or a part of that piece. If something is migrated, there's a 10-year time frame in order to do that, unless it's within 10% of a boundary. So there's a wandering boundary exception. So that's a big answer that kind of requires to look at the specific set of circumstances, because there's so many little exceptions to it. But if something is not migrated yet, it's a lot easier to adversely possess all or a part, provided that you can prove all those things. A lot of times with possessory title, though, there is some consent there. So someone says, oh yeah, he always let me use that, then that's not true possessory title. It would have to be, you know, Danielle put her house there, used the driveway every day. Everyone thought it was Danielle's land. No one ever said it wasn't Danielle's land. She paid taxes on it. Like, it's a fairly big test. A lot of times, unfortunately, you're trying to do is like things like woodlots and that sort of thing. So it's a lot harder to prove possessory title in those instances, but it is possible.
Okay. The Prestons must be fun, eh?
What's that?
The Prestons, East and North Preston.
I do a lot of work up there through legal aid. They've got a project up there to try to fix a lot of those titles. And it's the problem is a lot of those is it needs to be probated. So they've got, you know, 5 or 10 different people passed, and they had 5 or 6 kids who didn't have wills, and you know, there's some legislation in place that's supposed to help these files, but it's really not, because you can't get around the probate piece. So yeah, title is an absolute mess up that way, and a lot of times things were done with consent, so you can't get into the possessory stuff.
That's incredible. You've just blown my mind. I just absorbed more information in the last 55 minutes than I have, well, let's be honest, since Thursday of last week. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm new, so I'm like swimming in this information, but that was incredible.
Right. Give me a call if you ever have any questions on anything.
Oh, careful you say that to me.
I'd rather people ask me questions than, you know, than guess. I ask people questions all the time. So yeah.
Incredible.
That's the only way to learn.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you're most welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, I'm sure, Danielle, you will be getting some questions.
All good. All good. I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Like I said, this keeps changing all the time, but
awesome. I know it's
a
bit of a moving target right
wild.
now.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, take care.
All right. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.